Cool. Hello everyone. This will be the Counterplan lecture for the open debaters for the upcoming 2023, 2024 income inequality topic. So there are a few things we have to cover for the Counterplan lecture, and I'm going to be honest, the Counterplan ground on top of the this side ground on this topic makes policy debate really fun on the negative, but really difficult on the affirmative. Right? So we're going to go over a few things. The first one is we're going to go back to the basics of counterplan debates. What is a counterplan? You know, how do we structure a counterplan? How do we deploy a counterplan? Right? How do we answer counterplans? Those things have to be included because you all sort of need a reminder, and we should always know so that when we talk about the more advanced stuff, when we talk about like specific advantage counterplans, process counterplans, conditions counterplans, the different types of counterplans, right? The differences between each of them, how do we answer them, how do we deploy them, etc. And then we'll talk about like theory and competition. I'm pretty sure most of you all don't understand counterplan competition in terms of textuality and functionality, right? Can anyone here explain textual and functional competition? One person. Congratulations, not for me. Okay, next slide, please. So, what is a counterplan? There's this really neat book from 2005 that I was like referring to when I was learning debate. It's about 500 plus pages of dense debate generic stuff. But they have a pretty good idea of what a counterplan is. When the negative finds it desirable to admit that there are certain problems in the status quo, very similar to what the affirmative does, right? They can introduce a counterplan to meet those problems, to solve the same problems that the affirmative finds problematic in the status quo, right?
Sorry.
A counterplan is an alternative policy action. A counterplan is an alternative policy option. Different from the plan. If it is the same than the plan, then it does not compete. Differentiation between the counterplan and the plan need to occur, right? In order to win and reject the affirmative plan. Questions? Does that make sense?
Yes.
They both have to have problems. Counterplan needs to be different, and it needs to be able to reject the affirmative, right? Counterplan needs to be a better option than the affirmative, right? So, very simple. Sometimes the counterplans are literally just the plan text. Those are my least favorite counterplans because I have to figure out how does that actually work in my brain instead of the evidence and the arguments leading me to it, right? The first thing is the plan text. Your counterplan, just like a plan, needs to have a plan text. If it does not have a plan text, it is not a counterplan, right? Secondly, it must establish whether it is functionally or textually competitive based on how you write your plan text. How you write your plan text can establish whether or not a permutation is possible versus your plan. If there is a combination of all of the AF in any part of the counterplan, then it is not good enough if the net benefit, right, story can be quickly sucked up. Secondly, it must have solvency. Just like has an affirmative, they need to solve their AF. The counterplan needs to be able to solve the problems that it indicates is a problem in the status quo, just like the affirmative case. If my affirmative is trying to solve for income inequality, this counterplan solvency better be able to solve most, if not all, of income inequality, just like the F. Right? It should be at least even when it comes to what they're trying to solve. Thirdly, it must have a net benefit. It must have a net benefit, something that it can use, right? That the affirmative cannot have access to. It can be a disad, like politics or the economy that the counterplan doesn't link to, or it can be something unique to the action of the counterplan that because of the way the counterplan is deployed, it resolves an issue currently happening now that the app, because of the way it happens, does not solve. Okay? So the plan text, just what I said above, it is very similar to the affirmative, and it needs to set up functionality and textuality in the debate. Right? Now, how many of you all seen a counterplan with like multiple planks on it that denotes like 30 actions, or 4 actions, or 5 actions, or 3 actions, where I say like, you know, we will do this, and we will do this, and we will do this, and we will do this. Those are multi-plank counterplans. Each plank is an action of fiat. How many uses of fiat does the app get?
1.
If the app uses more than one action of fiat, what happens? They're cheating. Right? This counterplan can have 1 or as many planks as it wants to create more forms of fiat. We generally see multi-fiat as bad and cheating because it is not reciprocal. But it is up to the negative to figure out, do they want to run more than 1 plank? Right? My students generally only run 1 plank because it's simple. I don't want to deal with theory debates, and it's complicated to deploy multi-plank counterplans. Fine. It needs to be able to solve. Right? You have to be able to explain to your judge just what the counterplan solves. If you can't, you're going to be in trouble. You should read solvency evidence in your counterplan in a constructive, if possible. That means a couple of things. You may not need to read it in the 1 and C shell. Why is that? Can anyone tell me why it might not be necessary to read solvency in the 1 and C shell? Do we have another constructive? We have the negative block, right? If you want to be tricksy, and you want to be a little bit, you know, cheaty, and negatives are always cheaty, right? You could just read the counterplan text and establish the rest of the shell in the block. Especially if you're going like 8 off, and you just like hate the affirmative team, right? Some people do that, right? There have been finals of the NDT where 3 counterplans are read in the 1 and C, and none of them have any evidence or analytics other than the plan text. And then the block blows it up. Strategic choice of whether or not your evidence occurs in the 1 and C or the block is up to you. My personal preference, until you all get good enough in debate, put it in the 1 and C. Don't confuse yourself, don't confuse your partners, don't confuse your opponents, and definitely do not confuse your judge. If your judge is confused, it means it is not a viable option in the 2-1. The net benefit story, right? The internal net benefit. What if the affirmative, right, solves for income inequality through a UBI? And I say, no, a green federal jobs guarantee for everyone is much better. An internal net benefit for that the affirmative has no access to is I can resolve issues of climate. Right? If I give everyone $1,000 every month for the next however many years, how many of you all are going to purposefully go into the climate industry and solve it? Very little of you. But if I make a green federal jobs guarantee counterplan to solve income inequality and solve climate change, I have now established something that the counterplan solves for by itself that the app has no access to. That is an internal net benefit that goes in the counterplan shell. Okay? The external net benefit is something that the counterplan does not link into, but the affirmative does. Let's say I want to talk about the states counterplan, right? It's a national topic. The actor of this, resolution is the United States federal government. What is a different actor that has an encompassing power all around all of America? The states. A state's counterplan is going to be one of the more important counterplans you have to prep for. If a state's counterplan exists, are states going to be as actively important when it comes to the presidential elections? Or will the federal government passing a plan through the legislature and being signed by the president have more an effect on the elections? Right? The states will not have any effect, but that elections this had will link to the AF because of its actor. But because the states don't have anything to do with federal elections, it will not link into it. An external net benefit is generally a dis side that we run as a separate off case. You could, if you wanted to, put it in a counterplan shell, but for the sake of, clarification of just make it easier on yourself for organization, we put it in a separate sheet by itself. Because what happens if you kick the counterplan? Does that dis side go away? No, you could still use it. But what happens if you kick the green federal jobs guarantee counterplan? Does that internal net benefit go away? Yeah. Right? Because the AF can't solve for it, but the counterplan is the only one who solves for it. If neither of them can solve for it because you kicked it, does that matter? No. It's like it never existed. Right? So external net benefits, put it on a separate flow. Internal net benefits, put it on your counterplan flow to make it easier for you to keep everything organized. Right? So how do you answer those counterplans? Right? Just like when you were in JV, you were introduced to how to answer those fun little counterplans. Right? It doesn't really change between the counterplans, just how you answer them changes. Right? First thing you always want to say is permutation. Somewhere on the top of the way you answer a counterplan always has to exist a permutation. And there are ways where you can run cheating permutations and justify it versus cheaty counterplans. Right? So what's an easy permutation everyone learns? Right? Perm do both. When we say perm do both, we're literally saying take the full action of the plan text of the 1AC, take the full action of the plan text of the counterplan, combine them, and see what it looks like. Is it a better option than the counterplan by itself? A permutation must include the entirety of the AF. What happens if it doesn't include the entirety of the AF? Right? You've conceded that parts of your AF are not important, you should probably lose. The second option is theory. You don't have to run theory versus every counterplan, because maybe you don't have time to, but you should think about, is this counterplan cheaty enough that I may want to deploy theory? Do I want to add theory to my blocks so that I force the negative to abandon this, right? The more answers you have to these counterplans, the less likely it is for the negative to go for it in the block if they have multiple off cases. If I put 20 answers of these sort of things against a counterplan, this counterplan is going to have a difficult time to be won in the negative block. There is a good chance they will abandon it and go for a different flow that is less covered. Right? How much you answer the counterplan can dictate how the block will function. You can control the negative based on how you answer it. Theory arguments are just saying your counterplan makes it really difficult for the game to be played fairly. You're going to hear the word fairness a lot in debate. You're going to hear fairness literally everywhere you go in open. Fairness exists in T. Fairness exists in what? Framework? Fairness exists in T framework, right? Anything that has to do with the models of debate, the rules of debate, that isn't substantial to like AF versus neg, and just looking at it from a substantial point, will have fairness or education somewhere in there, right? Just like how a negative can say no solvency to the AF, the affirmative can say no solvency to the neg. Your Green New Deal counterplan does not solve climate change. Your Green New Deal counterplan will actually, make things worse. The Green New Deal counterplan, just like Diego indicated, will have a rider attached to it that would make political reform impossible. Right? You need to attack the solvency mechanism, minimize it, deny that it does anything, right? Because when you're comparing the action of the AF and the action of the counterplan, you want the affirmative to come ahead in the tiebreaker of like, how much do you each solve? If the affirmative solves more than the counterplan, I'm probably going to vote AF if there's a risk maybe of like a turn on the disad, right? Or if there is a turn on the counterplan, that just makes it an impossible option for the disad to matter. Okay? Turns. Can you run disads versus affirmatives? Right? You can, right? It's one of your core negative options. Isn't a counterplan just a different policy option that disagrees with the status quo? That means we can run disads against counterplans. Right? What if I tell you the counterplan is way more expensive than the AF? And then the negative reads an econ DA. Can I say that that counterplan links harder to the econ DA? Right? Now the disad that they've read applies to the counterplan. What if there's no econ DA in there? Can I read an econ DA that links to the neg? Yeah. Yeah. A lot of the counterplans are affirmative cases, FYI. This is one of the few topics you will have topical counterplans. Because they all do different things, but they all try to solve for social inequality, income inequality, right? Fiscal inequality. So save your disads. Are there portions of the link-specific actions of the disad that link to the counterplan but not the AF? Yes? Go for it. Run the link. Run the impact. Turn it. Right? And then the last part is turn the net benefit. Turn the net benefit. If I run a Green New Deal counterplan, right, that solves climate change, I could say no. Not only do you not solve climate change, but climate change is good. Right? It's one of the few disads you're allowed to turn. One of the few impacts you're allowed to turn, because there's a bunch of scientists who are probably not correct saying that climate change is great for other things that solve extinction. Don't personally agree with it, but in debate, it's about evidence that establishes truth, not whether or not you believe that. Right? That's an internal net benefit. If talking about external net benefit, like the econ DA, the politics disad, the inflation DA, right? Those disads, everything about DA, what Diego taught you, if you apply to those disads on the 2AC level, and you turn it, link turn it to yourself, now if the playing field is even, and the disad goes both directions, who wins when there's its tiebreak? If the tiebreaker is literally everyone is even, because you've won the link turn that it also applies to the AF, who wins? The AF does. The affirmative will win if it's a tiebreaker, if it's completely tied. Why? Because the negative has to prove that the affirmative is a bad idea. Has the negative proven that the affirmative is a bad idea if they literally just do the same as the AF? No. There's no net benefit. Why I should prefer the negative position, right? There's a lot of counterplans on this topic. A lot of counterplans. There's a lot of types of counterplans. Last year, we had cheaty counterplans. This year, take that and times it by like 3. And that's your counterplan ground for the topic. You all know what Pixar?
Yes.
It means you agree with all of the affirmative minus one portion, and then you run turns or disadvantages to that singular portion. Right? What does every AF have to do on this topic? It must fiscally redistribute, right? That's the first half of the resolution, and it must deal with one of the 3 planks: UBI, Social Security, Federal Jobs Guarantee, right? What if we pick out of fiscal redistribution and say, no, deficit spending is bad, progressive taxes are even worse because the IRS would get overloaded? Now I run an IRS tax decide versus the affirmative, a fiscal redistribution counterplan, which is a PIC, or deficit spending counterplan that picks out of fiscal redistribution. Now you have to defend why progressive taxes or fiscal redistribution is good, right? That's the only thing the debate is going to come down to. About stuff about the UBI, federal jobs guarantee, Social Security, that part of the app does not matter. All part of the app now is depending on how do you defend fiscal redistribution, right? People might say you don't have to spec that in the 1AC. You definitely don't. But you should have evidence that defends it, because if you get hit with this counterplan and you can't defend why fiscal redistribution is good through whatever means that you're going to deploy in the 1AC, you're going to encounter problems, because this is going to be a core pick, right? What if we pick who gets access to a UBI? What if the affirmative picks 4 marginalized groups that get access to a UBI, and I say 3 of them are great, 1 is not? Probably going to sound racist saying that first, but it's still a strategy, right? Picks are fun. As a negative team, you're looking at the apps and trying to do the least amount of work to have to debate the entire affirmative. Pick. Use the picks. Get creative. It's hard for the affirmative to answer creative picks. This topic allows you to access the picks debate like nothing else, because one of the actions of the affirmative is pickable, right? Agent counterplans. How many of y'all have heard that? Did y'all have agent counterplans last season? Right? Instead of like NATO, we would have like the EU do it, right? Instead of NATO, somehow like the WTO would do it. Instead of NATO, right, the UN would do it. Instead of NATO, Canada would randomly do it. I don't know why Canada, but apparently Canada is important, right? Maple syrup, bears, I don't know, right? Didn't we just talk about states? Is the states different than the federal government? It is, right? How many branches are there in the federal government?
3.
Does the affirmative pass through all 3 branches?
No.
It does not. A plan goes through the legislature, the Supreme Court, or an executive action where the president makes a decision that this will become policy. You can ask, how does your app pass in cross-X? More often than not, topical plans will go through Congress. If it goes through Congress, that means there's 2 other giant actors in the federal government that you can use. One of them is going to be the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has ruled in some instances that they can interpret how to give people money and ignore certain rules. The Supreme Court has a lot of flexibility when it comes to this topic, and is going to be one of the core agent counterplan grounds out there, and how they interpret the Constitution for fiscal redistribution. Right? There's evidence out there. It exists. It's in camps. Are the courts shielded from politics? Does a court's decision have anything to do with a presidential election? What if we need the courts that are illegitimate now because they've been running some really sketchy decisions, and we need people to feel like the courts are actually a tool for the people? Would legitimizing the courts be a good idea? Yeah, I've given you 2 net benefits to the court's counterplan. Guess what you have to do if you're AF? Can you use, UBI is good, it's blah, 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 versus the courts? Especially if the courts give it to? No. All you have access to is courts are bad, right? So when you're prepping against agent counterplans, you must say why your agent of action is good, probably in the 1AC. right? How many of y'all had NATO is good last year somewhere in the 1AC? Right? That's to prevent and preempt agent counterplans. You all should have something about why the agent of action is important, because you don't want to have that debate in the 2AC because now you're behind. Right? The solvency evidence in the 1AC should include, I don't know what that means. It's just a lab that doesn't get popsicles later. Right. So now I lost my thought. Right. So always have your solvency specify why your agent of action is important. If you don't do it, you're going to have a tougher time. All my teams do it. Right. Move on. The advantage counterplan. This is my personal favorite, because it doesn't have to do with about anything about, you know, the wording of the affirmative. I am not just randomly saying, yeah, I don't feel that the Congress is a good idea or fiscal redistribution is important. I don't care about any of that. Advantage counterplans are hard to predict, because all they have to do is solve an advantage. If you're running a soft left app with one advantage, that counterplan just has to solve one advantage, right? And it doesn't have to be anything about the topic. So what does that look like? Housing. If I give people, right, who don't have or who are homeless a UBI, does that guarantee they get housing? What is very difficult to get access to without a house? You don't have an address. It is incredibly difficult to access specific benefits that the federal government gives us without a house or an address. If we give people free housing as a counterplan, can that solve some of the social inequalities that homeless people face? Yeah. Does it have anything to do with fiscal redistribution, UBI, Social Security, federal jobs guarantee? It has nothing to do with it. It's completely separate. Now you have all that this adds to the topic as your net benefit. Advantage counterplans can take advantage, rephrase that, advantage counterplans can utilize a lot of the core negative disads versus the affirmative and not link into the counterplan itself. Advantage counterplans are cheaty, but they're amazing when deployed correctly. Right? Free college. How likely are you to land a higher paying job if you go to college? Do you think you're more likely to get a job if you go to college or you go to higher education or trade schools? Right? Trade schools are important, by the way. Someone needs to do the electricity work. Electricity is how our entire world functions. Right? Don't undermine trade schools. They make bank too. They make bank, FYI. Right? If I give you access to free trade schools or colleges, I give you an internal link into solving social inequality. Is giving everyone, free college part of the resolution? It's not. You could specify a UBI to be used for college, right? But that's a conditions UBI. It's very, very specific and probably not super significant, right? So a college counterplan would solve an advantage of social inequality, and it can do other things that, that the affirmative links into, but the college counterplan does not, right? Advantage counterplans are going to be hella fun because climate change is a major impact, right? Because the Green New Deal app is one of the core apps. A UBI app is a core app. Generic federal job is a core app. Expanding Social Security, right, and giving people Medicare for all can be a core app. Any counterplans that resolve healthcare, warming, income inequality, or advantage counterplan net ground. Fun times. Process counterplans. This is the hard one. This is the hard one. And this is the one that is deployed to you randomly in elims and you go, what? Do you know which agency the plan functions through? Which taxing agency it goes through? Do we? We just say normal means, right? But is there an actual legislative process? If we were to implement a UBI of, Congress debating it out, passing it, the president signing it, what happens then for it to solve social inequality? The process of what happens then is said as normal means. If the negative specifies this is how it works, but in the process of how it works, something bad is going to occur, and instead of using that portion, we use something else. We use a different taxing agency that we feel has enough jurisdiction towards the affirmative that it can do it so it won't overload a different agency. Is there a different taxing agency other than the IRS? We don't know. But we could create a new agency through a process counterplan. Because we could run an IRS gets overloaded this ad. You're going to have to say IRS good, right? That it can solve the app. And you can't just say normal means solve, because they just said you can't solve through normal means. They've turned the normal means part, right? Process counterplans are incredibly cheaty, they're incredibly hard to predict, but you should have a general idea of how your plan functions post it passing. Because if you don't, some smart aleck negative team is going to do their research and go, aha, got you, right? And I'm staring at one right now that does a lot of research to affirmatives. The negs are always very interesting and graded, and they always catch affirmatives. You always catch affirmatives, right, randomly. Right? It may not be through a process counterplan, it definitely occurs. And I love counterplan debates, by the way. I can cheat my way through a ballot, I definitely will. Okay, this is the fun part, and a lot of y'all will have difficulty with this, but I hope that this is explainable. So, why is competition important in a debate for a counterplan? If your counterplan is not competitive, what does it lose to? The perm. Right? Competition is established that the permutation, combination of the affirmative and negative, don't randomly make it go poof. What do I mean by textual competition? I am meaning literally a text of the affirmative is not included in the text of the negative. If I say, do the plan except this part, and I include the entire plan text, and then say except this part as like a pig, is that textually competitive?
No.
No, because I've included all of the affirmative in it. Remember last year when people read a turkey pick, right? And they say NATO minus Turkey, or NATO except Turkey? That is a non-textual counterplan text, because permutation, do both, resolves it, right? And proves that it doesn't textually compete, because the permutation does include the affirmative, right? If I say all relevant, or name out each NATO country and exclude Turkey and not say it, will do the action of the plan. Is that a textually competitive counterplan? Yeah, because it does not include the entirety of the plan for it to be included, right? So when you're writing counterplans, make sure there's a difference between the plan of the app and the plan of the neg. It seems redundant and so sort of like, why does it matter? It's always going to be that way. You'll be surprised how many people are lazy. And we'll put except and including, right? And just include the plan text in there. Don't be lazy in how you write your counterplans. Just like how we're very, very critical of the affirmative plan text, we're very, very critical of the negative plan text. What is functional competition then? Right? Functional competition literally means, is the action of the affirmative different from the action of the negative? If I say the United States federal government should do the app, I didn't ask for a spec, and I say on the negative, the legislature should do it, are those the same actions? The answer is yes, because normal means through this topic is probably through Congress. I didn't ask them and I still said through Congress. The USFG, right, isn't Congress part of it? So you're basically doing the same action. Are they different words? Yes. But is it the same action? Yes. Right. Another one, a state's counterplan. Right, the United States federal government should. The states and all relevant territories of the US should. Does that include all of the plain text of the Act? No, because the word United States federal government doesn't exist in there, right? Is it a different action than the affirmative? Yes, of course, because it's an entire different agency, of bodies of agencies that the states utilize versus the federal government. That's a textually and functionally competitive counterplan. Because you should not lose to a permutation of do both. If your counterplan immediately loses to perm do both, you need to fix your counterplan text. Right? Regardless of the dis-ad debate, regardless of the net benefit debate, your counterplan text needs to be competitive. Because just like how we hyper-scrutinize the affirmative, we hyper-scrutinize the negative. Next slide. Theory. I'm going to be honest with you all. Theory should be a big chunk of your blocks this year. Theory should be something that you all start to learn as quickly as possible. Because process counterplans are super cheaty, advantage counterplans are super cheaty, Pixar super cheaty, agent counterplans are super cheaty. All the counterplans on the neg are super cheaty and built for the app to have to debate itself. You should deploy theory versus these counterplans as a standard response to the counterplans. Okay? The quicker you all get access to theory arguments and deploy them, the more practice you'll have with them. So when the chips matter, you all can actually win your theory debates instead of waiting until like an elim debate to deploy your first theory arguments. So these are all the general theory arguments that we generally run, because any single type of counterplan we feel is cheaty, right? The one that I will include there that I personally feel is cheaty as a judge, and I hate seeing in rounds, but all policy debaters do, is the multiplank counterplan. Because I feel like the counterplan getting action to like 6 instances of fiat is super cheating versus an affirmative that only gets 1, right? But I always vote for it because affirmatives don't know how to theoretically say that's a bad idea, so that the negative kicks the counterplan and answers the theory shell, or not, or just answers the theory shell, right? So, first thing first. All those terms that said, agent counterplan's bad, process counterplan's bad, those are interpretations. I have made a statement that I feel is true for debate as a game. Right? Your interpretation must be clear. If it is ambiguous and you say counterplans are bad, bro, we're going to be in trouble. Right? If you just say counterplans are bad, we're living in the 1980s. And no one's going to buy your stuff. I'm going to be honest. I'd look at this flow and be like, what are we learning today? Right? So clear interpretations specify what type of counterplan you feel is problematic. Right? And say it. Say it. And then accompany it with reasons to prefer, or it's bad because 1, steals affirmative ground and forces the affirmative to debate itself. 2, infinitely regressive, right? Because they can always exclude any portion of the affirmative and find any reason why they disagree with it, right? Destroys breadth of education. We should prefer that because this is a big topic and we should be centered around social inequality instead of the nitty-gritty that ignores income inequality that is such an important issue that we need to talk about. Right? And other theoretical reasons as to why this counterplan is bad for debate and bad for education. Right? Fairness and education are going to be your terminal impacts, and it should be something you talk about somewhere at the end of it. Right? Now, how many of y'all put theory in a different flow? How many of y'all like to put theory on the same off-case flow that you all put it in? If the counterplan flow is going to be ginormous for the 2AC, put it on a separate flow so that all of your arguments can be in one area, especially if you're going to deploy more than one. I like to deploy about 2 or 3 per area, right? Especially when there's multiple counterplans out there. Conditionality, specific counterplans are bad. If there's a critique, why the critique alternative is probably problematic. Right? Sometimes they only do 2, but sometimes those 2 debate or 2 shells explode, and I don't have enough in that little column portion I gave it. Right? So if you're going to deploy more than 1 theory shell in a round, please put it on its separate sheet of paper, just for organization's sake, and so that your partner doesn't randomly drop it. There's nothing worse than dropping theory. Now, if you are facing these theory arguments, what is the first thing you do in cross-X? You should ask if there are any theoretical reasons why I should be rejected or why we should lose, until you can actually catch it based on what they say in there. If you all are just following the docs, they extempt theory arguments, you're not going to catch it. And they're going to go, aha! When one AR is going to come up and be like, they've conceded this theory argument, it's game over. And that'll be the top of the 1AR, and it is game over. And if it's not, that's judge intervention, and we're going to talk about that judge later on, right? So here's an example. Which one is this? Process counterplans are cheating. What? And I just named them. I just write down the numbers next to it. Right? I actually can't see the text. Right? I said seals affirmative ground, right? Versus the app to defend a minuscule portion of the debate, right? Instead of the entirety of the debate. The second one is makes the entire debate about one singular process, which destroys education. Third one is not real world. This one's probably not true. I'm just trying to add more standard or more reasons to prefer, right? No one argues about different federal agencies. The fourth one is infinitely regressive. And my last portion is what are my voters? What are the impacts that are going to be expanded if this becomes the debate? Right? Your theory shells should have an interpretation, should have offense, and should include voters. If you don't include one of those, all those things, your theory shell is incomplete and you should not deploy it. Fun times. So, just like how there are cheaty counterplans, how the affirmative deals with those cheated counterplans can also be really cheaty. How many of y'all have heard of intrinsic and severance permutations? So, a severance permutation is when an affirmative combines the affirmative case, or the affirmative plan, and the negative counterplan, but excludes or severs part of the affirmative plan. They do so that they don't link into the net benefit of the counterplan that links to them, but not the counterplan.
Isn't that the argument that the affirmative must defend like the entirety of the plan?
That's why we say severance permutations.
But wouldn't that still mean they're not defending the entire plan?
It's the onus of the negative to say that the affirmative has failed to meet its burden because they are severing out of the affirmative in the permutation text. And if this is the 2AR, they should lose. Right? It is up to you as a negative to tell me why the affirmative should lose, and vice versa. Don't expect the judge to do the work for you. Like I'm looking at this term and it's like, I think this is severance. Am I going to auto vote the other team? No. Right? Always check a permutation if you're the negative to see if it is severance. Does the action of the permutation or the permutation text, if you were to do it, does it include all of the affirmative and any portion of the counterplan? If it includes parts of the AF and not all of the AF, that is severance. Same page? This one's very common, right? Intrinsicness permutation. Intrinsicness permutation. Sounds fancy. It's literally just saying if you add stuff to the perm text that is not in either the affirmative or negative plan text, you're cheating. If I say perm do the app and then the counterplan, is the word and then in either of those texts? No. It also adds an element of time. Does the counterplan happen at the same time as the app? Yes, because fiat is immediate. If fiat is not immediate, we're never going to end the debate because we can always have times of when will the app happen, right? The implied thought is when we fiat an action, we look at the immediate consequences of that action. When we fiat the app, that's what we do. When we fiat the negative counterplan, that's what we do. So when we perm them, we're looking at the actions happening together at the same time. When we say and then, we've now added an element of time that was not part of the affirmative or the negative. What happens if I say, let's do the app and wait till the elections are over to do the counterplan? Or let's do the counterplan, wait till the elections are over to do the app. Will the app then link to an elections this app? No, because it'll be gone. Right? Intrinsicness permutations are cheating. And there is no defense of it in debate. Severance permutations are cheating. There is no defense of it in debate. Fun times. That's it. Questions? Concerns? Obi?
How would like if you want to say intrinsic permutation bad? Because severance is easy, but how would
Yeah, intrinsic permutations are bad. This permutation includes this portion that is not in either of them. You should reject them because it allows them to solve any sort of offense that the negative can, not then use in the debate. Right? It means that we'll never win, i.e. fairness as the vote. Very simple. Right? It is now the job of the affirmative to prove why that permutation is not intrinsic. Once.
So like, can the app run severance or intrinsic permutations?
Yeah, you should if you want to.
But like, it's just, the neg can just very easily say that.
Yeah. Now, here's something very interesting about this. You don't have to answer that theory argument. The other one, about like you ran a cheated counterplan, you should lose, you have to answer that. But if you're affirmative and you ran a permutation, you don't have to answer it if you don't go for the perm. If the perm is not in the 1AR, you can ignore that theory argument, okay? That's a very, very important distinction. One of them you have to answer. One of them you don't, regardless of whether or not you go for it. Okay?
Yeah, so for our InterText for theory, it can just be X CP bad?
Right, because you're telling me what type of theoretical arguments or what type of off-case positions, there are a different policy option in the affirmative that should not be included in debate because it skews fairness or it decks education, right? Yeah?
Why don't you have to answer from theory if you're not going for the perm?
Because the affirmative is a response to a negative position. The negative is an introduction of an entire position. That is not a response to really anything. Right? I don't have to go for my responses. Generally, I should go for my off cases. If I say condo is bad, and you don't answer condo, do you lose? If I ask you in the cross-X, the 1 and C, hey, what is the status of your counterplan? Right? And you say it's condo. And what happens if you don't answer condo?
you lose?
Why? Because those are the off cases you introduce into the debate that make the debate unfair for the affirmative. Right? The affirmative running theory arguments or cheating permutations was not an introduction of an entire set of arguments, right, from the playing field. The arguments, the theory arguments that kick the affirmative, what happens if the affirmative says the word, United States in the plain text of the app instead of United States federal government? Is that the same thing? If I'm negative, the answer is no. Right? If I'm the negative, if I see an affirmative text that says United States, especially if it's uncapitalized, I'm going to be like, yo, you're going to lose to plan flaw theory. And I've seen debates end in plan flaw theory. Because they introduce a position that is part of the stock issues, right, that does not fall into the resolution. The resolutional question of who is the actor is not specified in the affirmative. That means you are not topical. Even you can say, no, this is the USFG. Then why didn't you write down United States federal government? Instead you said United States, right? You have to answer that. We can't just choose to not answer that, right? But a 1AR doesn't have to answer the permutation theory if they don't go for it. Okay? I'm gonna switch things up because I'm gonna waste a little bit more of our time because I think this is important. How many of y'all have heard of condo? How many of y'all have heard of dispo? How many of y'all have heard of unconditional counterplans? What about critiques? Unconditional critiques. You all know what that means? No. Unconditional means this off-case position that we feel is a better option than the affirmative will be at the end of the debate. We are going to go for it regardless of whether or not you think it's a good idea, whether or not my partner thinks it's a good idea. Unconditional means I am going to go for it, period. This will be in the 2NR. It is going to be a good chunk of my 2NR. You don't have to worry about me being cheaty, about me being able to kick it anytime I want to. I will go for it. What is dispositional then? The quick answer is, I actually don't know. The answer to what is dispo is IDK. And that's the real answer. What is the norm answer for dispositional? The other way to say what is dispositional is, I will go for this off-case argument, I will go for the counterplan or the critique alternative if you do not put offense on it, if you do not turn it. Is that it? No, I got that backwards. If you did not put defense on it. Yeah. If you straight turn it, I will go for it. But if you put permutations, if you put no links, if you put no impacts, I'm allowed to kick this position anytime I want to. Because I can concede one of those, I can kick that shell. Right? But debaters cheat. And they don't want to have a clear definition of a status of an advocacy, so they'll literally say anything. Be like, when I feel like it. Right? Or they won't be asked. And the negative will be like, it's dispo. That means we can define whatever it is and then cheat through their teeth. Right? What about condo? What is condo? Conditionality means I can kick this off case anytime I want to because of this word called negation theory. Right? Remember how yesterday they were talking about what is the role of the AF and what is the role of the neg? The role of the neg is to just refute the AF in any way possible. Right? Elvis and Jason deployed contradictions theory as to why that's probably not a good thing. They could have also run condo and have that as a plank for it. Right? Condo depends on negation theory being an ideal theory of how to play the game. The interpretation for condo is slightly different too. You can just say conditional advocacies are bad. Is that specific? It's not. It's very generic. What happens if the negative is literally reading one counterplan, one disad, T in case? Is one condo really that abusive? Right? The answer is no. What happens if I run 4 counterplans? 2 critiques, a disad in case? Does that seem much harder to answer? Especially if the critique hits the counterplans? Right? If I'm running set call, and I don't think there's any hope within civil society, and I'm running a state's counterplan, that I think there is hope in civil society, what do I do as the affirmative? What are my options? One of the first things I will say is condo, or performative contradictions. Condo. right? And then you use the amount of condo that they read in the negative as your interpretation. If they run 3 conditional advocacies, your interpretation is 3 condo is bad. Why? Because the more specific it is, the less wiggle room the negative can say reasonability. Because 1 condo is pretty reasonable. Is 5 condo a lot harder to answer? Yeah, so it doesn't feel as reasonable, right? So however many conditional advocacies there are in the 1NC, the 2AC will say just as much in their interpretation. If you are negative, you add +1. +1. Or defend as many condo as you want. Just ones you don't violate. If you're running 5 condo and your interpretation on the neg is 2 condo is good, do you meet that interpretation? No. Because you're not 2, you're 4 or 5, right? If you're 5 condo and you say 2 condo is good, you just ran a shell that you don't meet. That's good for debate, right? If you're answering a condo shell as a negative, you always answer it with a counter interpretation you do meet. And why you meeting that interpretation and why that interpretation is good. Now, why do you think conditionality is bad? We just referenced one of them. It allows for multiple contradictory worlds that forces the affirmative to turn themselves and makes the debate impossible for the AF. Forces the affirmative to debate itself by running multiple contradictory worlds. Second is time skew. The trade-off of answering all the conditional advocacies correctly trades off with the affirmative because a negative can just pick and choose which one is the least covered and go for it in the 2NR. You can always use not real world, right? Someone disagreeing with a plan or a bill being passed will not introduce all these theoretical arguments on an ideological level, plus all these different counterplans at the same time. That is not how, arguments against a bill passing occur. Each senator or representative usually has one major point of contention with a bill, right? And a bunch of other reasons as to why condo is bad. When you're writing these shells, always have a voter at the end. Some of the old school judges won't vote for it if there's the word fairness or education isn't included. At this point it seems redundant because it's always going to be later on in the debate. But some of the judges won't. They just put fairness and education as a vote. Right? If your answering condo is good, neg flex is your biggest piece of offensive reason. Negative flexibility, because it is reliant on negation theory. Right? Reliant on negation theory. The second thing is real world. You will say, no, actually it is real world. The only job, right, senators do is bicker. All they do in the House of Representatives is bicker with each other, right? They always complain that there are always these different things that we can do. The combination of that is the negative, hence it is real world. It's good for education. It forces the AF to defend multiple points that creates critical analysis and increases critical thought. But also neg flex. I'm the negative. I can do what I want. And that's probably the truest argument, if I'm being honest. Right? You can also say no end-round abuse. There must be abuse in the theory shell that makes it impossible for the affirmative to debate for the judge to vote on. And lastly, and something that I don't think you all utilize enough in debate is reject the argument, not the team. If you feel we still violate the theory shell that the affirmative runs, that's great. Just don't make us lose. Like we have other positions that we can go for the dissent. In case turns, we'll go for that instead. Just reject the argument, all those conditional worlds, and we'll go for something else. GG. Right? For every argument and affirmative mix, there is going to be a response from the negative, and vice versa. Questions? Concerns? Comments? Okay, cool. We are done. Jason, we have 20 minutes left till lunch.
Yes. So I think they should go back to their labs. And then, because the lab areas were lunches.
Yeah. My team can just stay, or my squad can just stay here. Just come up. We need to have a talk. Addison, give me the thing.